Well, hello there, wizards. It's the devilishly handsome Dev, SBMTG. We like it, the magic, and I hope you don't mind if I share the good news with you, brothers and sisters, because hallelujah, Angels is finally a playable standard deck.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs.
And we're back to look at Esper Angels, a deck that's been slowly getting pieces for over a year now, but it's always had holy armor, by which I mean armor that has holes in it. But with the release of new Capenna, the deck might get the other kind of holy armor, the good kind, like you want. And that's because this deck got a couple of really good pieces from this new set, but not as many as you might think. We'll talk about the Angels I don't think you should be on a little bit later in the video, but we'll start with the ones from the new set that I think you should be on the most, and that is probably the one you expect the most, and that is Giada, Font of Hope. Probably the card with the highest disturbing flavor text to playability ratio, like, of all time. And despite the legend rule, we're still going to play all 4 copies of this. I want it on turn 2 in basically every game of Magic, so it's important that we play 4 copies, and she's got a huge target on her back. Everybody wants that Halo, so she's going to get shot down a good bit of the time, so it's nice to have another one waiting in the wings. Just a 2-mana 2/2 with flying and vigilance is a pretty heavenly body in and of itself, but it's all the other text on the card that we care about the most, right? We can ramp into a 4-drop Angel on turn 3 with this, which is awesome. We can give +1/+1 counters to all of our Angels and make them bigger and bigger, which is also awesome and works with at least one other card in the deck. And again, it's probably not the one that you think. This little card just fills a lot of the holes that the Angels deck had previously, right? It needed more early drops, check on that. It needed to get faster, check there. It needed to get bigger and survive more meat hook massacres. This card helps do that, check there. So it just does everything the deck needed. Plus, she's a progressive, by which I mean she makes your creatures progressively bigger. I have no idea what her politics are, although a pretty safe bet that she's anti-Halo. Now, we'll get to the other new Angel that I'm playing from this set in just a minute, and again, I think it might surprise you, but for now, let's talk about the other 2 drops in the deck. We're playing 4 copies of Youthful Valkyrie, because of course we're doing that. This card is not available in draft boosters, and that has driven the price up to $4, even $5 from some sellers. This is actually one of the most expensive Angels in the deck, and it's also, I believe, the only one of 2 uncommon Angels in the entire deck. So the price is kind of wonky on this, but it's going to be worth it to have more 2 drops. Trust me, you want this card, and I probably don't have to explain that to you. But still, it being more expensive than a Giada is odd. That's odd to me. But we're also playing 4 copies of Luminar Aspirin. Look, it's not an Angel. It's like the only non-Angel creature in the entire deck, but it's also the best white 2-drop in all of Standard, and like I alluded to a moment ago, the +1/+1 counters will help with another card that we're playing. And I want to go ahead and bring that up, but Luminar Aspirin is just the best. It's a good old white 2-drop in a deck that's really looking for good 2-drops, and this is about as good as we can do, period. There are other 2-drops that I was looking at, like, Tenacious Underdog was even a thought at one point. It draws cards, little resiliency, it's things the deck needs. But no, in the end, Luminar Aspirin was easily the best 2-drop that I could have played in the deck, besides all the Angels that we're playing. But one way or the other, I just can't think of a good reason to justify not playing this card in the 2-drop slot. Because, I know you're sick and tired of it. We all are, but there's a reason it's in so many decks that have planes in them. Just play Lumi, you'll be happy that you did. But let's get back to the Angels here. We're on to the 3-drops. We're actually not playing too many 3-drops in this deck, but that's okay. If we get a turn 2 Giada, we hope to just go straight past the 3-drop slot and play a 4-drop on the next turn. So it makes me feel like we actually don't have to play too many 3s, but we're going to play 4 copies of Righteous Valkyrie in this deck. Honestly, I don't expect to get the double Anthem effect off of a Righteous Valkyrie too often, unless you get 2 Righteous Valkyries on the table early in the game. We've all experienced that from time to time. Pretty easy to get, quadruple Anthem effect in that situation. But in a lot of games, you're not necessarily going to get to 27 life, but this will still help you race aggro really well. But the other 3-drop that we're playing in the deck is an all but forgotten creature that is probably the absolute best reason to play blue mana in this deck, and that's Linvala. Lin-Vanuel Miranda is what I've started calling this card because it's just dumb enough to be catchy and I can't get it out of my head. But this has saved me from countless situations, and once we get to the example games, you'll see exactly how good this card can be. We'll move on here to the 4-drop slots, and we will start with 2 copies of Legion Angel. Yeah, 2 copies in the main deck. There were a few reasons that I did this. Again, we want to ramp into a 4-drop Angel with Linvala on turn 3 if we can help it. And honestly, in the early drafts of this deck, I wasn't playing enough 4-drops. I felt like adding a second copy of Legion Angel to the main deck would help alleviate that. And wouldn't you know, it did that. But we also, towards the end of building this deck, needed another sideboard slot. I was on 16 cards in the sideboard, and I really didn't know what I wanted to cut. So cutting a Legion Angel from the board and putting it in the main deck actually helped out a lot with the sideboard building as well. So that's a couple of reasons we ended up with 2 of Legion Angel in the main deck. But one way or the other, you want to play at least 1, if not the 2, in the main deck, because this is honestly one of the better Angels in the entire format for making sure that you stay resilient and you get the card advantage that you need. Now we're also on 4 copies of Furia's Retribution in the 4-drop slot. Now Giada can't ramp into this, which sucks a little sometimes, but it's not so bad if you're able to go Giada on 2, 4-drop Angel on turn 3, and then Furia's Retribution on 4. Plus, it's just nice, even though you can't ramp into it with Giada, it's still good in a deck with Giada, because Giada is going to make every Angel that you played before this a little bit bigger, and thus more able to kill things in Chapter 2. And, for that matter, more able to get through for buttloads of damage on Chapter 3. So, again, even though you can't ramp into it with her, Giada still tends to make Furia's Retribution a really good card. And it was already pretty good in the Angels deck, right? But it just got that much better because of Giada. But for sneaky meta-dependent reasons, this card was already a little bit better over the last couple of months. Why is that? Well, the Angel this gives you has Vigilance, and for that matter, Giada has Vigilance as well. Why is that important? Well, one of the most played cards in the format right now is the Wandering Emperor, and its 3rd mode needs the creature to be tapped in order for it to actually flash in and work on an attacking creature. So our Vigilant guys are really important, and I should probably bring that up. I'd be dumb not to bring that up. It's a video about tech. That's really important tech, just so you know. But sometimes deck techs are also for convincing you should be playing a card that you think is bad. And this is one of those deck techs, because I am on, still, somehow, 2 copies of Metropolis Angel. Let me tell you why, actually. I'm still on 2 copies of this card. It's a good Magic card. Turns out this card's quite good. Again, we need 4-drop Angels to ramp into with Giada. And believe it or not, there just aren't a whole lot of amazing options in this format right now for great 4-drop Angels. But Metropolis Angel, not a bad option at all. We actually get a 4/2 flyer if we ramp into this with Giada on 3. And note that it also gets a +1/+1 counter if we ramp into it with Giada on 3. Also, just to warm this argument up in the microwave a little bit, just to bring it home for you, this card often has relevance the turn it hits the table, even on curve, right? It almost doesn't matter what 2-drop you play. You're probably going to get a +1/+1 counter out of it. You get a Luminar Aspirin, that's pretty easy. If you play a Giada on turn 2, all you got to do is play another Angel, you get a +1/+1 counter. You can do that just by playing a Metropolis Angel with a Giada on the table. If your 2-drop is Youthful Valkyrie, all you had to do was, again, play a Metropolis Angel, and your Valkyrie gets a +1/+1 counter. So, again, it is very easy to get +1/+1 counters on Angels in this deck really early in the game. So Metropolis Angel on curve, on turn 4, will often draw you an extra card. And if your opponent wants to spend removal on Metropolis Angel, that's removal they don't have for the better stuff in the deck, like, for instance, the 2 copies of Lisa. I didn't forget about you. You beautiful Archangel, you. Talk about an angelic frame on this thing. A 4/5 life-linking flyer is good enough to get out in front of a lot of aggro decks just by itself. But if you have a Giada in play, and God forbid, another Angel or 2, this thing can get up to 6 or 7 power pretty easily when you drop it on the table. And when she does resolve, then it's really hard for your opponent to get rid of your other stuff. And it doesn't even have to be Angels. This pops Luminar Aspirins back to your hand just like it does your other Angels. And it ends up saving all your most important stuff, right? If you have this down when your opponent finally kills the Giada or the Righteous Valkyrie or the Metropolis Angel that's drawing you all the cards, well, you just get it right back. Kind of no harm, no foul. Between this and Linvala, we actually have a fair amount of, like, sweeper protection in this deck, and this even protects us from, say, a Meathook Masker, which is relatively important too. A card that I think, again, we're already somewhat protected against. Our creatures have high toughness to begin with, and they often can get bigger in a variety of ways. So we're already pretty good against the most played sweeper in the format, but this makes us even better. But I really just couldn't resist playing 1 copy of Rampage of the Valkyries. I had to cut a copy of this. I was originally on 2, but then, I brought a Legion Angel in from the sideboard. I had to cut a card from the main, and Rampage was the first thing I thought. And honestly, I haven't looked back. You can't ramp into this with a Giada just like a Furious, which can kind of suck from time to time. You have to actually wait till you get the 5th land on turn like 6 or 7. Sucks. But when you actually do get it down, it can be nice like protection in this environment against decks that you're kind of at creature parity with some of the time. The other mid-rangey decks in the environment. But there's also plenty of tokens decks, the Ob Nixilis decks that play like lower to the ground creatures, and they can make devils that they'll be more than happy to sacrifice when they kill one of your angels, right? So this card has lost a little bit of its stock, mostly because of how expensive it is, and because of all the little dudes running around right now. But I think it's still a decent card, right? 5 mana for a 4/4 with a keyword ability or 2. It's nice. And in the meantime, it's really good with like Lisa. If you have a Lisa and a Rampage out, they kill your angels. You get your angels back, and they have to lose guys. That's a bad deal for them most of the time, and they don't like playing against it. So the card has still been good enough for a silver bullet, but that's about it. But we'll finish it off with a little bit of removal. That we're playing some actual removal. I know Rampage kind of feels like a removal spell. It's like a half of a removal spell, but you actually need some real point-and-click stuff in this deck, even though I think that one of the deck's biggest weaknesses is the fact that in the main deck, it doesn't play any real removal that gets value, nothing that 2-for-1s or a sweeper that can 3 or 4-for-1. We are only playing single target point and click removal, and I actually think that's not good enough a lot of the time in the current standard, but you still want to play some of it, and you'll feel really bad if you don't. So we're on 3 copies of Vanishing Verse and 2 copies of Void Rend. While we have blue mana, we might as well put it to good use. Despite the fact that we're in an Ob Nixilis format, Vanishing Verse is still a perfectly castable card a lot of the time in this environment. Even against the Ob Nixilis decks, you just can't target an Ob Nixilis, but it's still fine in a format where Tenacious Underdog, for instance, is a very important card. So the Exile clause on this matters, but Void Rend is still pretty okay too. It's not as good as I wanted it to be because it's 3 whole mana for single target 1-for-1 removal, which again, I don't think is as good as it used to be, especially in an Ob Nixilis environment. But still, this can kill one of the Ob Nixilises, which is good a lot of the time. And the fact that it can kill any spread of permanent types is great. But I don't think we need to play 4 copies of this. I think 2 is probably fine. But now let's have a look at the mana base, which is actually relatively complicated, mostly because of all the different lands that we have in Standard, all of which I want to play. There's 26 lands in here, but 2 of them are Amiria's Calls, so they kind of don't count. I think you do want to play some number of these in an Angels deck. It makes sense to me. But altogether, there are 19 white sources in this deck. You need a lot of white with this deck, but there's also 16 black sources. There's a fair chunk of black in the main deck, but there's a ton of black cards in the sideboard, so we do need lots of black sources. There are 11 blue sources, which doesn't sound like much, but we don't really need blue until turn 3, so 11 is about right. But now let's look at the sideboard, which also got more complicated than I expected. You see the 2 copy of Legion Angels that you knew were going to be there, but there's also some concessions against aggro. We have 2 copies of Ray of Enfeeblement against the mono white decks, 1 copy of Blood Chief's Thirst, which is the card that I added when I brought in a Legion Angel from the sideboard and put it in the main deck. There's also 2 copies of the Meat Hook Massacre, which increases the total cost of the deck by $110, because this is the most expensive card in Standard by a mile. If you don't want to play this, maybe try a Depopulator 2 instead, which is only $0.25 right now. Seriously, brand new card, hype sweeper in the set, $0.25 American dollar. So I could understand if you wanted to replace Meat Hook with Depopulate here, but there's a reason Meat Hook is so sought after and highly played, is all I'll say. But maybe one of the most important cards on the board is the 3-of Check for Traps. This is our best defense against Ob Nixilis in this format. We just want to pluck that out of their hand on turn 2 as often as we can, and it is, if you sniff out an Ob Nixilis, often worth kind of skipping your turn 2 and not playing a Giada to do this instead. There are definitely use cases for Eradicator Valkyrie, but the number 1 use case is against the Wandering Emperor. But let's quickly talk about some cards that I didn't play here. I didn't play Inspiring Overseer in this deck. I just feel like, especially since we're Esper, there are better 3-drop options. We get to play Linvala instead of this. If you wanted to increase the number of 3-drops in the deck, I could see playing this card, but I don't think it's worth increasing the number of 3-drops just to play this card. Aside from that, there's Resplendent Marshal, another decent 3-drop, but again, even with 19 white sources, I don't know that I really want this to be my 3-drop a lot of the time, because it's not going going to do much in the 3-drop slot. So I'm just never been a huge fan of Resplendent Marshal, and the fact that it's relatively difficult to cast really made me kick it out of the deck. So didn't end up in there, but there's also Sanctuary Warden, another cool angel that you probably thought I was talking about when I was talking about angels that care about counters being on things. Now, I could see playing this, especially considering we can ramp into it, but I still think it's fairly slow to be playing in this environment right now, and I'm just not sure that adding it and removing another card, remember, would really add much to the deck. I mean, experiment with the card if you want to, but I'm someone who was very high on Sanctuary Warden. It's on my sleepers list and everything, but I just don't think this is the deck for it. Aside from that, Starnheim Unleashed didn't make it into the deck. You can't ramp into it with the Giada. I kind of hated that. You want to play 1 copy or 2 even of Starnheim Unleashed. It's an explosive card in the late game. I could see doing it. Adds to the deck's resilience, so that's pretty decent. But in the end, I just felt like there were better ways to use our slots, point blank. But now let's look at your power rankings. A final score of 69.
Don't do it, Dev. Don't you say it. You're an adult. Don't say it.
That's a fine score. Some might even say nice. Now, the thing about this power ranking here is that it almost made me change the way I do power rankings, because I wanted to include like half a point and quarter of a point here and there, right? Because really, that power being an 8 is kind of rounded up from a 7.5. That speed being a 6 is kind of rounded up from a 5.5. The synergy being a 7 is actually kind of rounded down from a 7.5. The versatility is actually more of a 5.5. The resiliency is more of a 6.5. You see, there's a lot of half a point, but I felt like in the end, it all kind of averaged out to where that's about right. So, in the end, this deck does a lot of things fairly well. It's more resilient than you might think. That's one of the kind of key components to the deck between, again, Lisa, Linvala, and in the main deck, Agadeem's Awakening. There's a lot of resilient stuff going on in this deck. And although, again, it has some weaknesses, right? The Ob Nixilis deck, especially if the Ob Nixilis deck gets to go first, can present some issues to this deck, which just wants to play a creature every turn and get on with its life, whereas that deck is exploding with board presence, can put 4 permanents on the board on turn 3, right? So it's hard for us to keep up with that kind of stuff, but it's hard for a lot of decks to keep up with that. And honestly, if we can play a Righteous Valkyrie, play a couple more Angels, keep our life total up, it should be okay. It's not like the Ob Nixilis match is unwinnable, but if they get to go first, there can be some issues. And honestly, if any deck gets to go first, there can be some issues. One of our biggest weaknesses is our opponent getting ahead on board. But when the deck gets rocking and rolling, it feels great. And again, once you get that Linvala down, that Lisa, you feel pretty invincible a lot of the time. But on that note, I should probably show you these things rather than just keep telling you them over and over. So it's time for the example games. You love these. Or at least you seem to get pretty upset when I don't do them. So I should probably keep doing them. But I got 2 to show you this time around, although they're both very quick games. They both do a good job of showcasing how Linvala especially, but also Lisa, are very important to making sure this deck can actually cross the finish line. But the first game in particular is a good example of how good Metropolis Angel can be some of the time. And the second game is a pretty good example of how amazing Giada can be.
All right, in this first game, we get a snap keep because we have a 2-drop and a couple of decent 3-drops, not to mention the 4-drop Metropolis Angel. We start on Lumi, who immediately gets a counter against this Bant control deck, it looks like. They foretell a Doomscar. On our turn 3, we play Linvala, get in for 3 with the Luminar Aspirin, and say go. They're going to get a Broker's Ascendancy on this turn, which can be dangerous, but it will never have a chance to actually do anything. On turn 4, we drop Metropolis Angel, immediately draw a card on the attack, and get in for 7, which is quite a bit of damage. Our opponent is already at 10. Note how much value we're getting here. Opponent Doomscars, we do not allow them to 2-for-1 us, and Metropolis Angel will eventually draw 2 cards this game for us. We get in a little bit more, put the opponent at 2 and drop a Lisa. They then Doomscar again, but seeing as how Lisa works, we get a couple of our things back, and once the opponent realizes how Lisa works, they scoop the game. Now, I don't like our hand in the second game, so I take a mulligan here and end up putting a land back, but we still have Giada into Linvala, which feels pretty good up against this Blood on the Snow deck. We hide the Eye Tyrant turn 2 and get down the OG. On turn 3, our opponent actually plays a Curse of Leeches, which gets a nice from us. We go Linvala on turn 3, get in with the Giada against our opponent. They finally get Toshihiro Yumizawa's Ghost out on the battlefield, and They also say go without doing anything, which gives them a Leeching Lurker. That's a great target for our Vanishing Verse. We also get a double spell with an Aspirin, but they get to use their Power Word Kill, a card they normally wouldn't get to use against us like in this matchup, but we still get in for a good amount of damage. Opponent stuck on lands here for a moment has to say go. We drop a Youthful Valkyrie that gets kind of big thanks to Giada. They invoke Despair, we get rid of the Youthful Valkyrie, but still not that big of a deal even though they drew some cards. At this point, we Furia's Retribution, get a 6/6 because of the Giada, which I just want to point out. They finally get their 6th land, technically, but it's tapped, so they have to say go again, but not before they march our 6/6. That will put them back up to 10. At that point, they have now gained 10 life in this game, thanks to Memory of Toshiro and March of Wretched Sorrow, so that feels pretty good for them. But still doesn't matter. They can't escape us, not quite. They get in for some damage because they can't block our creatures anyway. We throw down a Tara so that we can Rampage, and then we get in for a little bit more damage. This time, they're actually going to play the Blood on the Snow, now that they have the mana to do so, but it's not going to matter because Linvala is such a ridiculously good Magic card.
Good game, opponents, but that is all I have got for Esper Angels. I hope I brought you around on the deck. I know that it's hard to believe that Angels will ever truly be, or in some cases, some people are jaded and cynical enough to believe that no tribal deck will be like decent standard, but I think Angels is just about there at this point. If you don't believe me, I hope you get a chance to try the deck out. Link in the description to TCG Player down there. That'll take you to the deck list so you can peruse it at your leisure rather than watch some fathead run his mouth for another 20 minutes, although I would appreciate the view and the watch time. You want to do that, you can. You can also like the video if you want to and sub to the channel. I would like more subscribers, I'll be honest with you, so sub to the channel if you haven't done it yet. Apparently about 34% of you or so, I just checked my analytics, aren't subscribed. What are you doing? You watch my content. Come on, man. Sub to the channel. But anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Just let me know how you felt about the whole thing down there in the comments section. How would you build the deck differently? Don't tell me Metropolis Angel is a bad card until you played it. I'm telling you, give Metropolis Angel a shot. But aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff. We've already discussed that. You can check me out on Twitch, live streaming some games at twitch.tv/SBMTGDev. And if you really feel like it, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG. Link in the description for that. If you just give me $1 a month, you can vote on what content we do. That's why we did Esper Angels and not Mardu Planeswalkers, which was only like 2 votes behind Esper Angels. So if you'd have rather seen that deck, you could have affected that vote. Just hit the link in the description, go to Patreon. I would really appreciate your support. My V-neck just keeps creeping down this whole video. I'm sure that's not off-putting. I apologize. But anyway, I love you all. I guess I gotta get out of here. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Remember to spread love and be kind, because the angels are watching.